everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Securing Digital Supply Chains, Start with Firmware, sponsored by Eclypsium. My name is Mary Lynn Gollier of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Jake Williams, SANS Senior Instructor, and Michael Thielander, Director of Product Marketing at Eclypsium. If during our webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Mary. My name is Jake Williams. For those that don't know me, I'm a senior SANS instructor and do a lot of work with the analyst program. And I absolutely love supply chain. And it's not often that we get a chance to talk about firmware. And I love the graphic here where it's the magic smoke is leaving the computer, right? It's not often though that I'm joined by somebody who absolutely gets it when it comes to firmware. It's not often we even get to have these discussions. And so I want to kick it over to Michael. He is an absolute wealth of knowledge when it comes to firmware threats. We're having a fantastic discussion today on one, what is the threat, but then also how do you mitigate some of that threat? Because I think today a lot of us throw our hands up and we're like, ugh. Anyway, Michael, so happy you're with me today, man. Introduce yourself to the audience, if you will.
Great. Thanks very much, Jake. And I'm happy to be here too. So again, I'm Michael Thielander. I'm Director of Product Marketing at Eclypsium. This is probably the fourth or fifth SANS webinar that I've done on different topics. I love doing this. I've been in cybersecurity for a really long time. It feels like 20 years, but it's probably been about 15 years. So excited to kick this off today. You ready to jump in and let's get cracking?
Born ready.
Okay.
Let's do it.
I'm going to start off, and this isn't really intended to be a quiz at all, but I'm going to start off with just this view of some of our favorite brand names, some of the brand names that are sort of representative of Americana, right? The brand names that we've all grown up with, the brand names that we love. Some of them are getting kind of beat up. I remember Toys R Us was a really big deal when I was a kid, but now Amazon has sort of swallowed it up a little bit. But these are well-known brand names. So here's the quiz question. What do these brand names all have in common, right? What is similar with all of these brand names? Really, it's going back to this article that came out at the end of this last year, the top 10 worst supply chain disasters in history. So I won't go into all the details of really, this physical and shipping side and material side of supply chains and what actually caused these disasters and how some for like the Denver airport were around logistics and setting up their initial, baggage handling system. I will touch on a couple of them because supply chain disasters have a tremendous impact on just your bottom line, the valuation of a company. So let's pick on one here, Foxmeyer Health. This was a great little company. It had about $5 billion in revenues. But after some of these supply chain problems, the company was sold for about $80 million, which was a huge hit to the investors, obviously. So, the pandemic is over. I like to say the pandemic's over. We've learned a lot. We've come through it. One of the things that I think I really actually appreciated, if I can say that about the pandemic, is it gave us some really nice appreciation for memes, right? Some really great memes came out of the pandemic. One of my favorites was the Hold My Beer meme. So I want to look at these brands and say, okay, here's a Hold My Beer moment. And I'm going to throw out a hypothesis. I'm going to throw out a prediction that these supply chain fiascos that are really marked as the top 10 failures in the history of Western commerce are really going to seem trivial when we start tallying up the impact and the results of some of the supply chain failures in modern ICT or information and communication technology supply chains. In fact, we're already down that path. And this is one of the reasons I'm guessing why Jake loves this topic, why I like to talk about it. Supply chains are so fundamental. They expose so much of, both what is good with the way that our commerce works and the way our interconnectedness works, as well as what some of the threats and challenges look like. And just a couple of these to touch on. We don't have to go and do, a forensic analysis on this, but we know like SolarWinds in the Orion product. We can't talk about supply chain without somebody mentioning, SolarWinds. The fact that there were, 30,000 installed customers of the Orion product, maybe 18,000. We're not really sure what the total impacted number of those were, whether that's attributed to Cozy Bear or whether that's, attributed to Nobelium. We're still doing sort of the after action analysis on us, but that really set the industry back on its heels. The Kaseya attacks are evil, and their attacks, their exploits on Kaseya, and particularly around ransomware and what they were trying to, initiate there, 1,500 businesses or so potentially impacted by that, 70 million or so in ransomware offers. Of course, then our evil kind of went dark for a while and kind of resurfaced, but it's a reminder that the attack surface of supply chains is tantalizing. It's always there. I'll throw out another one, which is even more opaque to me. It's hard to really read something this recent, but this goes back to really the very beginning of this year, some attacks on GitHub, right? Using stolen OAuth tokens in GitHub. That exposes a lot of IP, that exposes a lot of product, that exposes a lot of supply chain threat. 35,000 repositories potentially impacted or infiltrated through this attack on GitHub. So we'll throw the hypothesis on top of this. One of the best ways we think, and what I'm going to hope to demonstrate with Jake's help today, to get in front of these supply chain attacks is to build and execute a firmware security program. And I think that a lot of people probably heard that, and it kind of does a little short circuit in their brain because we don't really have a good appreciation of the depth and strength of firmware. There's a lot of challenges with it. But I think, as we talk about that, Jake, your experience goes way back. What do you think about that kind of hypothesis?
Oh my gosh. I mean, Michael, I absolutely agree with this. And I think that anybody today that's arguing with me about the, is firmware security the bedrock of the rest of security, either doesn't understand computing or is just lost. I mean, we talk all the time about, lots of folks have griped about Windows 11 requiring UEFI for the, and TPM for secure boot, right? Well, there's no such thing as secure boot without firmware. And it's not just your PC firmware, there's firmware on your network card, your video card, it's all over the place, right? And I know we're going to talk more about some of the update challenges, but Michael, I'll share the hypothesis here, man, that we largely ignore this today because it's a problem that most people don't believe they can solve, right? And so they're focusing their efforts elsewhere where they think they can. And largely that's because, there hasn't been a lot of tooling, from a detection, even or a response standpoint that's been brought to market.
Yeah, and that's really the big point right there, is I think there's a lot of well-meaning cybersecurity practitioners and strategists that really understand what the gaps are in firmware, but really it's a little bit, I had a boss once that had this thing on his desk called the too hard pile. Here's all the stuff that is really, I don't have the time or the money for, or it's too difficult to do. And that's the too hard pile. So not saying that that's the case, but hopefully what this discussion and some others do is point out that it's getting a little bit easier. Some advances, particularly that are triggered by supply chain attacks like the SBOM we'll talk about, have gotten us a little bit closer. So today, here's our set of topics for today that we'll kind of whip through, and we'll do a little give and take back and forth. We'll share some material. We're going to talk about a recent government report on securing ICT supply chains that was done by Department of Commerce and Department of Homeland Security that I thought personally was very eye-opening and also held a lot of promise for some of the things that could be done. And then I want to rewind a little bit and say, okay, if that's the state of the world, if that's the scope of the problem, how did we get here? And what are the root problems beneath that we actually need to solve, whether that's a technology problem, whether that's a people problem, or whether that's a process problem. And then I want to talk about my premise. I'm going to let Jake throw some darts at it, and we'll see if we can take this notion of a firmware first approach to securing our supply chains, whether it's viable, whether whether it's something that can be understood and then fit in on the plate of all of the other things that, again, those cybersecurity strategists and practitioners have. And then we're going to wrap up with some tools and some resources that we can share with everybody. First of those that I actually want to hit on, and we'll come back to this later with a link. Jake, you had a report that you co-authored recently or wrote recently that really touched on supply chain in general and dependency attacks. And it also had some things to say about firmware. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, I did mention firmware in the report because you can't really talk about, again, as we talk about software supply chain security, as I mentioned, it is the root of, firmware is the root of trusted computing. And And anybody who debates me on this, I love to point them back to the Bloomberg grain of rice article, right? Granted, I think we've pretty much debunked that idea, right? Of, the super micro having the hardware implant right from the factory kind of thing. But then I'm going to ask you, what did it feel like in real time?
Right.
Because in real time, we had people losing their absolutely losing their their composure over this, and really spending a lot of resources trying to chase down how many of these do we have in our environment. If we have them, could they be infected, et cetera? And so I say infected, impacted. I want you to think now about something that is software deployable, because firmware it is inherently software. And again, most of us, I love the idea of the too hard pile, because I really do think that's where a lot of folks classify firmware today. And I think, to your point, as we kind of close out and wrap up today talking about tooling, I think it is because of that, right? You had an article up from Ars Technica a couple of slides back there. That's from 2013, where folks were destroying equipment, government contractors destroying equipment for fear of infected firmware. And I hate to say it, but the state of the art really has not advanced substantially since then, right? Today, it's really like, how do I tell if the firmware is compromised or not, right? So, again, bedrock of security.
Yeah. So we're going to pivot over to another report. I mentioned it earlier. One of the reports that came out earlier this year. This is the U.S. Department of Commerce. It's a pretty imposing looking building. I love this picture of it. Department of Commerce is really at the root of kind of all that we build into our way of life, our society, our even capitalism and the way that it works, even with the good and the bad and free market economy. And that they also combined this research effort with the Department of Homeland Security. So they came up with this assessment of the critical supply chains that support ICT, information and communication technology in the US, prepared by these two different groups. And they really pointed, if you haven't read it, by all means, go get it. This is one of the links that I actually didn't include in the downloadable PDF to this presentation today, but you will get links to lots of other material if you grab that PDF. Two things they pointed out. The root of some of the supply chain problems is the explosion in the use of open source code libraries, which we kind of all get. We kind of understand where that pain is and what's needed. But one of the things that was surprising was their specific call out around firmware. Again, if it's on that sort of too hard pile, people know that firmware is there. They know that there's a gap. They know that there's potentially a problem. Jake, you mentioned the Bloomberg article. That's a great example of why so many people were concerned and lost sleep over that. Whether the claims were true or not was because they realized that was possible. They had too little visibility over the firmware that they were just receiving with some servers in this particular case. And this article, or report, I should say, pointed out this is on the first page of the section about firmware, that it's a large and ever expanding attack surface. And that's what we're going to touch on today. It's bigger than we think it is. That this securing the firmware layer is just often overlooked. It tends to fall into what I call an organizational hole. You'll see us talking about the organizational hot potato in a little bit. And it's a single point of failure. Despite that, it's overlooked. It's a single point of failure that has a cascade effect across supply chains and across organizations. And the other key thing to point out, or that this report pointed out, was it's not just compromise and it's not just gaining leverage. It's a whole different kind of leverage. When you start compromising firmware, the reason I used that cool little clip in the beginning that shows the chip actually smoking up is because unlike just compromising and maintaining command and control over a system, I have the ability with firmware to brick systems, to kill systems. And what sort of created or initiated this report, you might remember at the May of last year, actually in 2021, the presidential executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. And it called out a couple things, like we have to really start executing on broad scale zero trust architectures and designs across our network infrastructure in both the public and private sector. We had to have a real strong overhaul of supply chain security strategies and tactics, and we're going to see that. We're going to see a lot of regulations and legislation coming down the pipe that are actually going to impact that. It also called for the creation of the software bill of materials so that we can track what's in our code much better. But for our purposes, and what I found important is it took the assumption that all firmware is more likely than not, it is critical software. We can no longer kind of leave that on the too hard pile. We can't ignore it because we have to assume by its nature that firmware is going to be highly privileged. It's going to be very powerful in terms of what can execute. And then in terms of where it sits in the stack, because firmware is so low in the stack, it initiates and loads before anything else. So if I can compromise firmware and convince it, regardless of anything else that happens after that, I have a very, very privileged position on those systems. And here's another sort of corollary or companion to my hypothesis. If solving our supply chain problems can start with securing firmware, there's a corollary to that, is that where our adversaries, whether those are nation state attackers or whether those are criminally motivated groups like our evil that we mentioned before, they're getting to know firmware better than we as defenders do. They don't have that notion of like, that's somebody else's job, or that's a different piece of code that I don't need to get into. It's highly privileged. It provides a lot of necessary instructions, and it's very, very unique. Each effective component of firmware is made to work with a specific component or model, and not just at the delivery level, but at the manufacturing level, the chips that are actually within it. We'll talk a little bit about all of the things that actually go into it. And importantly, firmware is the same as all the other code that we're using, but it's very, very different. And what I mean by that is it has the way that it works, the way it's designed, the way it operates. You can talk to like specialized, firmware software developers. It has very little to do with modern programming languages. So the things that we do for application security, the things we do for dynamic software testing or software composition analysis, or static testing don't really work that well for firmware. It's a different kind of animal. Because of that, the report really called out a lot of the challenges with securing firmware. Again, its privileged position within a device, attacks that are conducted via firmware grant really unique advantages. The notion that, if I go to if I suspect an attack or I see IOCs around a particular server or segment, that I can go and reformat those systems or reinstall the operating system, kind of doesn't work. Firmware has some unique advantages that let it persist beyond system layers, persist beyond some of those rebuilds of machines. And it's not traditionally been a high priority for manufacturers, and the report called out it's not always well protected. I think that may be the federal understatement of the year. It called out the increase in vulnerabilities. We'll show some of those. And then we went at Eclypsium, and this is one of the links that you'll find if you go to tinyurl.com Eclypsium survey. We kind of wanted to look at a particular segment and validate some of these findings. So we went to the financial services sector and interviewed 350 companies, and they're seeing a lot of attacks. There's actually 88% of the financial services organizations, these are worldwide, in every geo except for EMEA, basically. We found a significant number that had reporting firmware level attacks. 88% had reported being attacked in the last 2 years, and 54% of those say they'd been victim of firmware level attacks more than once, twice, or even 3 times. So of course the report recommends updates. It's the same, the challenges that we face in firmware are the same that we face in application software and API code and in operating systems. It needs to be updated, but there's some unique challenges around further firmware. It's not simple. It's difficult, and sometimes it's fraught with danger. It's fraught with danger from an operational perspective, and I can't tell you how many, network operations people that I've talked to that are hesitant to potentially update firmware because I don't know what the impact is going to be on that server, or say on that network device or that controller. So it's because of that, it's not always done. The report found that because of this, in turn, it may be difficult to quickly determine whether a device's firmware is up to date. And we find that quite a bit in Eclypsium, in our own world. We see a lot of firmware that's just never updated. We just look at our data, and we'll talk a little bit later about how our system in particular works. We've 83% of the systems that we touch and have access to and work through to help people protect firmware in those devices and those supply chains. The firmware is never updated before end of life of that device. Again, because of those challenges, I don't know what the downstream impacts are going to be. I don't know what testing is going to, I don't actually have time or ability to do the testing of it. And I don't know what the impacts are going to be if I deploy that. So because of all those things, that we have this feeling that we need to be upgrading firmware, we need to be updating it, we need to be patching it, but we're really fundamentally sort of afraid to do it in many ways. This, I think, is going to change, and there's a lot of things that are happening in industry that will sort of force this change. So one of my sort of call to actions, I think, for anybody viewing this, I think you're already viewing this webinar because you care about two things: supply chain security and this notion that maybe firmware, is overlooked, or I don't have enough of a sense of like the total attack surface or exposure of my firmware. Some things like new NIST 800-53 Rev 5 will sort of force our attention on that. When I started off in cybersecurity and I did my CISSP training through SANS many years ago, I think my instructors are long, long gone, replaced by able people like Jake. But when I looked at, Rev 3 at the time, there were about 16 specific references to managing or securing firmware. Well, we all know that Rev 5 is the thing now, right? So Rev 5 came out, there's about 160 unique references to managing securing firmware. This, I think, is the industry really focusing, sort of pushing us to say, yes, we've overlooked firmware, but we need to now bring that focus back to it. And as we do with everything else related to code, we need to look at all of the vulnerabilities that are in it. We have to appropriately prioritize those. When I say prioritize, that also brings up a sort of a little alarm bell for a lot of people, in that it's really difficult to understand and prioritize. We have hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities that we need to address. How do you pick the ones that I should address, the ones that would have the greatest bang for the buck, the greatest ROI, if I go through the effort of doing the testing, doing the deployment? Well, this is an interesting data point. CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the US, you probably all know who that is. They now have their KEV list, their known exploited vulnerabilities. And if you take that list and break it down into classes of code, you sort of find the usual suspects. We find operating system, we find virtualization code in there, we find obviously application level code. But if you break it apart and look at it objectively, one of the things that's driving the up and to the right of the most exploited vulnerabilities is firmware, the way that firmware is being exploited. And of course, I'll go back to my earlier statement, it's being exploited because our adversaries understand the power and privilege that comes with firmware. And they also, I think, know that they know it better, or have I should say, greater motivation to dissect it and understand it and figure out how to make it work than we do at actually defending it. So before I jump into the next section, Jake, how are we doing? Questions or anything that we want to chime in on?
Man, I was going to jump in there for a second on the vulnerability management side. And I think you're hitting the nail, Michael, just right on the head, right? We know that we know we have to patch, right? You brought up the biggest concern that I hear from IT operations teams consistently around patching firmware, right? Or some folks refer to as flashing firmware, what have you. You ultimately are taking a risk, right? Some percentage of those devices in any given normal update, right? We have to take an outage window, and some percentage of those don't, that they have some failure there, and so there is a big reluctance to do it. Which makes the value proposition for being able to detect and secure against firmware attacks, I think, probably all the more important. Again, this isn't a situation of not knowing what should be done. It's having the ability to do it quickly and quickly and safely, right? So many of these, I suspect, on the firmware known exploited vulnerabilities list, at least the ones I've looked at, most of these are embedded devices, right? So like Wi-Fi routers and IP cameras and you name it, but they are in your environment, right? Which is the whole, that's kind of the whole end of the point there, right? So anyway, absolutely. Fantastic. Yeah.
And I think that prioritization is one of the challenges, that there's a lot of vulnerabilities out there. There's a lot of things that people need to worry about and care about. And of course, we know that we don't have the resources, the people, or the tools to actually get on top of those. But I think the KEV list has done a good job of saying, hey, these are the things that you really need to care about. These are the ones that are most likely to get exploited by, again, either nation state actors or just financially motivated hackers that are out there. So for a little background on this, and again, I encourage anybody to send in a question during this. Jake's going to be my monitor since I can't see that particular screen, but let us know if a question comes up. If we say something that you go, well, that doesn't make sense, fire off a question for us. We're going to start hitting some hard and fast data points and facts now as we roll through this. So shoot some questions over. I want to talk about, why is this such a big problem now? And why is this happening so fast? When you look at that up and to the right curve on the CISA list, why is it so steep? And I mentioned a motivational factor in that our adversaries, I think, are better at manipulating firmware than we are at defending it. But let's just look at some of the numbers. Firmware is everywhere. And before I got into this work with Eclypsium, which I've really enjoyed for the last couple of years, I focused on file integrity monitoring, secure configuration management. I worked in machine identity management with Venafi. So pretty broad exposure across the different tools that we use in cybersecurity. I had no idea how much firmware there was in our infrastructure. I had no idea that every endpoint, the laptop I'm using, the one Jake's using, the one that you're watching this on, comes out of the box with 15 to 20 different firmware components. And that's everything from super powerful unified extensible firmware interface, UEFI, which is a mouthful, but those kind of that firmware that really is the interpreter of all of the firmware, to individual component firmware that's actually being compromised in a lot of these attacks. Servers is even worse, notwithstanding, we've had some false starts and some, false scares like around the Supermicro issue. Servers, though, have a lot of firmware, 30 or more components in every single firmware. And some of this is super important. BMC, baseboard management controllers, are unique to servers, and they provide remote management capabilities, the ability to, again, go in and potentially brick servers or, update a server or override an update on a server, so that we're doing a software update, but because, again, that firmware is so privileged, can basically look at the update and say, well, yeah, we're not going to update our firmware if this is the adversaries code talking. We're just going to take the number that you're putting on the update package and we're going to call ourselves that, and we're going to move on. 30 components in every server that we have to look at that with. And then, by the way, these numbers come from a Gartner report on managing and securing data centers, particularly. Now, if you look at network devices, this is where it gets a little bit more broad and sometimes a little bit scarier. There is really no kind of network device, whether that's a delivery system, whether that's an ADC, whether that's bridges or routers, whether that's a photographic photo management system that does not come with some firmware now embedded on it. And I think we've sort of lost sight of this, like the fact that every one of these. So the first point is that there's a lot more firmware really than we think there is. The second point, particularly with supply chains, is that, I'm always seeking the right analogy, and I hope this one works and makes sense for you. Firmware really is the glue of the supply chain. As we get different components and pieces, whether we get SMM memory from somewhere, USB components, or whether we get go back to trusted platform modules that Jake mentioned earlier, network cards and component NICs, all of these, what holds them together and makes them understand their role in the ecosystem, whether that's an endpoint ecosystem or a server, is firmware. Firmware is the glue that's holding the supply chain together. What I've related on these is some of the attacks that specifically target those points of view, whether that's in USB or whether that's in UEFI, whether that's, the Spectrum meltdown, that was really focused on CPU attacks and exploits and those specific vulnerabilities. Firmware is the glue of the supply chain. If I can compromise it, I have the ability to then get my way, get my leverage effectively. And I think that the challenge, the oversight, if you will, that a lot of us, assumption that we make, not necessarily a bad assumption, but an assumption that we make, is that our existing tools for vulnerability management or EDR or XDR are going to take care of those. They kind of actually don't. And that comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but to a lot of other people, it's not a surprise. We know that they were designed to really work at the operating system on up effectively. And so the code that's in firmware seems a little bit out of bounds. If I'm a director of vulnerability management or director of endpoints, it might seem out of bounds for my job. And I'm curious, from Jake's perspective, you talk to a lot of practitioners and a lot of people in the field. Is that a conversation that ever comes up?
Oh, I mean, so rarely. And again, I hate to be that guy, right? But even when it does come up, it's usually kind of poo-pooed away with well, okay, what do I do about it? Right. To your point before, Michael, right? We have such a hard time even working through vulnerability management for just operating systems and the applications that ride on top of them. When somebody additionally kind of throws in and says, okay, well, what about the firmware? Like it almost is one of those like echoing down a warehouse, or what about the firmware? What about the firmware? Because nobody really has a good plan around it. I think it falls right back into that too hard pile in the very, very few cases that the discussion's had.
Yeah. And we'll see again, the regulatory standards and some of the mandates that are coming down will tend to focus our attention there and say, hey, I need some evidence. I need evidence that this firmware has been updated. I need evidence that, this Wi-Fi components have the appropriate firmware in it. But that will add to, I think, another challenge. We know that firmware is everywhere. We know that firmware is critical glue that's holding all of our supply chain pieces together. But as you're saying, Jake, it's just very elusive. And when I say elusive, I mean organizationally elusive. Your average, talk to a lot of CISOs out in the world. I did an event in Portland, Oregon, in my hometown this last week, talking to CISOs that particularly are in the water industry, right? And they have a lot of different teams working for them. They've got vulnerability management. They've got patch management teams they work with. They've got their threat and incident response. They have a lot of different teams. But firmware is one of those things that is critical to all of these teams, especially if you're in network security, or if you're in threat and incident response, looking at firmware-based IOCs and how difficult they are to discern in network activity. Firmware is sort of in the middle of all these activities, but none of them really have the expertise to manage it and supply it. So my hope is through our outreach and working with programs like SANS is to get a sense of like, can SANS help solve some of this organizational educational challenge?
So, hey, Michael, I got a question here in the chat, and I think you're going to get to this. If you want to push this off a little bit, feel free, right? But NIST cybersecurity framework, basically a DS6 and DS8, deal with hardware, software, and firmware integrity. What kinds of tools can organizations use for integrity checking?
I will actually get to that. And I think it's a great question because there's a dearth of tools out there. There's very few, but there's a couple of open source tools that are starting to be available. And we'll talk about Eclypsium's role and what we do, and then our particular area of focus on that too. But that's a great example of a framework that really is going to start specifically calling out the need for validating what level of firmware I've got in a system. That gets me, I think that's a great pivot over to this section. I'm going to try really hard not to make this a commercial because we don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about things that you need to do if you're in cybersecurity, regardless of whether you use Eclypsium's tool or whether you go banging on your, say, vulnerability management provider and say, I need you to start looking at this. I need you to get this level of visibility for me. Or if you just hire the teams to manually go do it. I think there are three things that we need to do. There's three things that we've got to do to kind of get on top of this. I'm going to give some examples here. And this, a lot of you who have experience with firmware will say, yeah, that's hard. That's talk about the too hard pile. I don't even know where to start with this. But regardless of whether we go buy ourselves a tool, get open source tooling, or whether we just hire people to do this job, this is, I think, is a useful way to look at it. First off, identify the firmware that you have. We do inventory of everything. We have a huge reliance on asset management solutions to tell us where our devices are, what we're actually using in networks. But we have to discover the devices and then map those to the firmware that's in those devices. If you go back to my previous comment about 15, 20 firmware components in every single endpoint and 30 more in every server, there are things like this: processor and chipset, baseboard management controllers that I mentioned before, the TPM modules and chips. We need to be able to map those to the assets that we have. And the point is that when we get then an alert, when something happens, when we get, there's a ILO bleed is the HPE vulnerability in HP BMCs. That's a lot of alphabet soup there, but ILO bleed was a specific vulnerability that was being actively exploited. ILO is their integrated lights out in HPE servers. The point being, I need to have identified my HPE servers and identified the ones that are vulnerable to ILO bleed and identified what the remediation is going to look like. So I need a way to basically parse this out and say, okay, show me all the TPM, show me basically where I've got a particularly vulnerable, again, let's say like a ILO bleed component that's in a server. Show me where that is actually deployed. Start giving me some insight on when was it last updated? What's the registration on that? Give me some level of insight and visibility. And it's that insight and visibility that operating systems they don't provide. They don't really look at that firmware level. So that's the first thing, is identify the firmware that we have in the devices that we have. The second is verification. And it's really just taking some known good, some assessment. Now, in Eclypsium's case, we actually our founders came from Intel. They were instrumental in a product, an open source tool called ChipSec. To go back to the question that Jake asked, what's one of the first things you do? Leverage an open source tool like ChipSec, CHIPSEC. You can find it on GitHub, because the first thing you're going to have to do is verify that firmware. You're going to have to look at the actual code, get a binary sample of it, and verify that against a firmware database. Now, Eclypsium's firmware database is now well over 7 million different models or examples of firmware, and again, across endpoint servers, network devices. So as a tool and a solution that enables you to do that, that's a way that you can do it. But you can leverage something too, like ChipSec, like the open source community, and start looking specifically. When I find or I get a listing of, say, binaries or information on firmware that's in my system, start doing a sample of it. In our case, and this is actually a version of like how Eclypsium does it, start looking at the hash values, look at the specific characteristics of it. And just like we would if we were looking at file integrity monitoring or secure configuration management, excuse me, look for the changes, look for the anomalies, look for what is like not expected. So there's identify and then verify. And then, as you can probably imagine, the next step naturally is, how do I fortify that firmware that's in there? Fortify is a neat word. I like it because it means a lot of things. It means basically, just like in our configuration things that we have to update in, say, SCM components, firmware has configurations now too. Firmware is basically a little mini operating system that's encased in one component, whether that's a chip or whether that's a driver. And it has the same configuration challenges that every other file component has. So there are ways that there are known good configuration states for certain kinds of firmware, and there are also known bad configuration states. So set a known good configuration state and find a way. This is the big challenge. So I don't want to gloss over this because it is a big challenge. It does cause a lot of concern. Find a way to update that firmware that fits with your existing process, some way to automate the orchestration of that firmware. And that's usually where the big disconnect is, right? Because as security people, we can say, this is out of date firmware. I know that there's a new version. I want to do an update. And that's where things, the wheels start falling off. You know, can I get an update cycle? Can I get, you know, how do I fit with the deployment and automation process and orchestration? A tool like Eclypsium like this, we tend to fit with all these. And our goal is really to find ways to fit with all these tools. But everybody has these. We have Tanium, we have Microsoft Intune and SCM, SCCM. We have the tools that are specifically responsible for helping us do that deployment and configuration. Start asking the question. My request is start asking the question of, like, what's my level of firmware visibility with these tools? What's my ability or my inhibitor from being able to actually do some firmware updates on these as well? And start really pushing at this from that end of the industry as well. So we have to do fortification. Something like ChipSec will give you the known good source, but then we have to figure out how we're going to implement that, right? And there's going to be a lot of companies that are not ready to manage another tool like Eclypsium. They're going to need to figure out a way to build code to specifically wire it in with what they're doing with Jamf for Big Fix or something like that. So these are the things that we need to do as an organization. These are the sort of the pillars, if you will, of what we've got to do: identify that firmware, verify that firmware, and then fortify it. And now one more thing that I want to throw out there before we open up to questions or some other commentary is this task, this identify, verify, fortify, is the place we've seen the greatest success. The place we've seen the greatest traction is when they think about it in terms of doing it across the enterprise. If I'm a network device guy, I can think about managing the firmware updates, say, within a particular, brand of devices that I have. But if this is elevated to an operational, a CIO, CISO level, and I understand that I need to identify, verify, and fortify that firmware, and then I look at doing it across my infrastructure, you get a lot more bang for the buck. And it does come to basically saying, I need somebody to own it. And I want to see the day that I go to an organization and we said, yeah, I'm actually the new director of firmware security. Eclypsium, tell me what you can do for me. Because that's, I think, is a great day for us and for the industry. We start looking at somebody's job to manage this in endpoints, to manage that security in servers, and then across network devices as well. And I might propose starting at network devices because they really are the ones that are the most in the eye of the attacker right now. Just recently, a lot of exploits specifically targeting some F5 big IP issues and bugs, and I won't pick on F5. They do a phenomenal job, I think, managing their infrastructure, managing their security, and keeping it up to date. But the way that you do remediate, say, the top 5 F5 big IP bugs is you have to update your firmware. And again, we don't want to be at a point where, like, we say, okay, that's the solution, that's how we're going to do it, and sort of everything freezes up at that point, because that's, again, sort of the bridge too far. And a way to look at it is take the firmware problem and break it into 2 pieces, break it into 2 primary use cases. Look at this validating firmware integrity in the supply chain, sort of on the deployment, the acquisition and deployment side. And we have a lot of our customers in the federal government, for example, they'll look at validating that firmware in those systems as they get them. And then a different program where they're using the same information and insight, but they're now using it to look for continuously monitor firmware against any IOCs that we see, any modification or any attacks directly into that firmware. So I'm going to pause. I've just said a whole bunch. Jake, I'm going to let you jump in and I'll ask the question, and then we can get questions from the audience as well. I have this hypothesis. We also talked about some of the challenges. How do we feel about it? Is this doable, or will this live forever on the too hard pile?
Well, I guess if the question is it hard? I think the answer is objectively yes, right? But it also can't live forever on the too hard pile. Threat actors are increasing their sophistication. The known exploited vulnerability list alone, where we're looking at, again, these network devices, and that's such a fantastic point to drive home here, by the way, too, right? The vast majority in that firmware list for the known exploited vulnerabilities are themselves network devices. And so, this is a spot where we traditionally have very, very little visibility in the first place. Secondarily, we have threat actors that are targeting these. And then, for a third big point, they control where you go on the network, right? I mean, we made such a big deal out of, you probably recall a few years ago, Michael, right? DNS changer malware, right? Yeah. Everybody was worried about that because, well, it was, redirecting, endpoints to different, different locations. And my goodness, man, you control the network device, you control that. So I think we really have to step back and recognize that it's a hard problem, right? That the firmware security side is a hard problem, but it's not going away, and it can't live in the too hard pile forever, because as you point out, right, the stakes are high, right? So we do have a couple of questions from the audience. I'd love to kind of pivot into and maybe pick up some discussion too. But one of these that the gentleman asked here is, our vulnerability tools like Nessus, I mentioned Tenable.io, Qualys, Rapid7, are they just failing to detect firmware that's out of date? How's that working?
That's a big word. Failing is a big word, because
that's loaded. Yeah,
it's a loaded question, or a loaded word. And in my day job, I tend to rail a lot about vulnerability solution providers that talk about updating firmware. And I'll break this into 2 pieces. I won't say that they're failing. They were never built to do that. Where they do give you information, where a Nessus will give you information on firmware, they're basically asking the operating system for information on the firmware that's embedded in the hardware and the chips. So that's thing one. In most cases, I'm going to say, this is not a statistically proven data point, but I'm going to say in 9 out of 10 cases, they're not doing direct observation of that firmware. They're relying on the operating system to tell them what they can about that firmware. As we know, that's inherently fraught with danger, right? There's just challenges that circle around that, because it can be spoofed, the information can be spoofed. And I'll go back to my point is, they're not built for that. They're like Nessus, Tenable, Qualys are not built for that level of observation. And if we rely on them to just give us a report on what the operating system thinks is happening with that firmware without doing direct observation, we're making an assumption that I think will come back and bite us.
Yeah, I always analogize this when somebody's like, again, to your point around direct observation, that's so critical, right? And I love when we're relying on operating system, level to say like, oh, well, tell me what you know about the firmware. I feel like it's almost like TSA asking, instead of actually screening, you're just asking, hey, are you a terrorist? I remember back the old Airplane movie, right? Yeah. Kind of thing. Like, no, I'm good. Oh, come on through, kind of thing. And that, as kind of ham-fisted as that sounds, that's the way a lot of our firmware security scans today are done, providing there's nothing malicious there, right? To your point, this is just a possibly wrong tool for the wrong job. I love the redirection away from the word failing, but on that end, if there is no issue, right? There is no malware or malicious, malicious modification made to the firmware. You can probably trust those results, right? The problem is that we don't know where that's happened, right? And so relying on a tool to tell us, yes, everything's up to date, that itself is interrogating the thing that might be compromised it's just very, very difficult, right? And it's hard. We're already talking about this is the bedrock of trust, right? Well, us just saying, oh yeah, it's all cool. We're violating kind of that bedrock of trust, right? In that space. So yeah.
Great. Any other questions we want to go with while we're
I've got another one here, and I want to get your take on this because I think I'm the one who mentioned, or I actually can't remember who mentioned it first, but one of the folks asked, they said, believe that you mentioned, and they've heard as well, that firmware updates can be risky because they can cause system complications. Is this true? And if so, is it advisable to keep all your system firmware as up to date as possible, just like you would for other software updates? But Michael, where do you and Eclypsium sit on this?
So the reason that it's risky, again, comes to that lack of visibility, because we have adopted some assumptions as an organization on the operations team that we've got this golden image, this black box in firmware that comes from the manufacturer. And there's a little bit of a liability challenge. If I do what they tell me to do with that system, I don't really have to be, liable, or that's another weighted word, right? For downstream results. And so there's this feeling then, if I go to update, I've even seen honestly some server level manufacturers that make their own firmware updates and then tell their customers, not in writing, but I think in suggestion, that if you update that firmware, you're on your own for the consequences. That's a mind shift, a mental shift that has to change throughout the entire industry. We have to treat firmware as a first-class citizen. It is risky just because we've had limited visibility in the past. And yeah, there are some, just like when you do application code, there are some downstream, impacts that you may not have anticipated. But we have to, this sounds like a very boomer thing to say, but we have to kind of get over it. We have to accept that responsibility and realize that we need to start building and planning for that, because the counter to that is just too difficult to imagine when we've got firmware implants and exploits that could literally brick those systems, and I'm not updating it because I'm afraid of a potential production failure. The balance is way off, in my opinion, that way. So that's my point on updates. We do help people, and we do recommend that people get to a level of maturity where they are comfortable with updates. And that's not just updating the software. That's looking at what your fallback mechanisms are. What are your rollback capabilities? How are you going to handle those kind of things if they happen? And actually doing sort of internal threat modeling on what could potentially happen if I have a failure, if I have to do a firmware update and there is some sort of cascade of failures. How do I then reset that? We just have to get our heads and our practices built around that.
I couldn't agree more with that. And this is going to sound old school, right? But I guess maybe this is where we're at. Some of this is BCDR. Some of this is having the right SLAs in place. My consulting laptop, it's an enterprise grade laptop. And I did a firmware update early this year. And it caused issues with the laptop, significant issues with the laptop. Within 24 hours, I had a tech in my office swapping out the motherboard, right? Now I have that in place because I pay for that, right? When they ask do you want, this comes with a 1-year warranty. I'm like, no, I do want the $400. I'm going to come to your place in 24 hours and swap your stuff out if necessary. And that's really a spot where when you start, you mentioned maturity, right? This is a spot where I think a lot of folks take a look at budgeting and they're like, well, I definitely need that system, but what are the odds that something bad's going to happen? And I could just wait. I can be on the regular 5-day SLA. We'll ship it FedEx ground. And, it may not be the case that that's acceptable if we're looking at doing more regular firmware updates, right? And I'll throw out there, and by the way, too, I'm not saying that means everything's got to be like 24-hour SLA, because that's that's ridiculously expensive, across an enterprise, or can be cost prohibitive across an enterprise. But I'll also say I feel the pain, right? Because the gentleman that came out swapped out the motherboard, which was using the same old firmware that the original one was. And unsurprisingly, I'm like, well, are we going to flash this? And he's like, oh man, right on what you're talking about, Michael. He's like, I don't know. And I'm like, I do, right? Like, let's flash this thing while you're here, right?
Right.
And, but even the tech, right? Even their field service technician wasn't really comfortable flashing the firmware, the thing that started the problem, in the first place. And I'll be honest and tell you, I was kind of in that spot of like, maybe this is a spot, even as a security professional, maybe we just leave well enough alone here, right? And then reality kicked in, and I'm like, no, I can't do that. We've got to go forward here. But that's for me. That's not for a giant enterprise. Maybe if we're talking about upgrading the firmware on like your filer, when your storage area network, storage heads or filer heads. My gosh, man, that you probably don't have a secondary, tertiary, whatever, unit for all that, and that can create lots of issues. So
yeah, one of the biggest firmware centric exploits of the last couple of years was kind of in that realm. Again, it was Eclypsium file transfer appliances, right? But again, it's like really old infrastructure. In many cases, it's been actually in that infrastructure for like 15, 16 years, as long as I've been in cybersecurity. But the attackers found a way to compromise that really sort of embedded infrastructure, and was very, very costly for a lot of people. I mean, the names of people that were impacted by the Eclypsium FTA attacks they're big names. Morgan Stanley, right? The Reserve Bank of New Zealand. These are not trivial little names. So,
well, and a non-trivial amount of ransomware pivoted right behind the FTA appliance as well, right? Or FTA appliance exploits, right. As we see with numerous other, internet-facing, appliances, right, that ultimately have firmware vulnerabilities. Those, again, we see ransomware threat actors pivot through those. And the big ones, you mentioned F5 earlier. You just talked about FTA, the F5 big IP issue that we had earlier this year. These are the big ones that hit the news, right? And so I'm not worried about people missing those as much as I am the ones that are being exploited, but aren't catching enough media attention, or maybe there's not deployed in enough different places, right? But it doesn't really matter, right? The threat actors are scanning the internet looking for these. Once they're inside networks, they're doing port scans inside networks, and they're going to target these devices, right? And once they find them, especially again when there's a publicly available exploit for it. And so again, it's absolutely critical. And I'll throw out here too, for whatever it's worth, that so many of these devices simultaneously are the most vulnerable, and they're the devices we have the least visibility into, which makes them a perfect haven for threat actors, particularly your apex grade threat actors to sit on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I want to turn the story a little bit to how do we help people? What are the education resources that are available to you? Jake, I'll ask you to keep an eye on the questions. If we get another one that you think is germane that we want to jump in right away or that we can answer later. But I want to talk about some of the resources. One of these is Jake's report. So the reason I think this is a particularly useful resource is it does talk about all of the tools that are necessary on particularly around sort of your classic application and OS level software dependency attacks. But the principles remain. The principles of what needs to be done remain. And Jake said that it didn't mention firmware very often, but it does specifically call out a couple of examples where you can't exclude firmware. So if you need something to take to your boss, let's say, or to go up to the CISO or CIO and say, hey, we have to put this in scope. We have to start thinking about this in the context of our overall attack surface and our security strategy. I think that Jake's report is a really, really good one for that. So there's a link there on the bottom to that report.
And Michael, can I jump in here for a second on the firmware side and mention that, the title of and the scope of the report was detecting and preventing software dependency attacks, right? And it's not, I do mention firmware in there a couple of times. The reason it doesn't get more play is that I don't have a huge tool chest to recommend. I try to avoid throwing out there too much of the be afraid, be very afraid, but I don't have tools for you here, right? Don't have a good plan for you. So it's not that it's not important. I want you to know this. It just came down to, having those recommendations to here's what to do. And I came up short.
Yeah. And that's a problem with firmware in general. So, and I think there's also a language problem there. Like, here's a funny thing, Jake. It's all code. It's all code of some kind, right? And we tend to have this mental dividing line between software, my responsibility, firmware, somebody else's responsibility. But it's all code. The things that you recommend that people do, there's not a lot of tools, as you mentioned on this report, but I again point people to open source tool like chipsec, right? Go to chipsec and at least get the known good baseline examples of what good firmware should look like. And we're going to start seeing more and more tools. There are more people in this game every year. Last Black Hat, we saw, I think I counted 5 different presentations around doing integrity checking and verification of firmware and systems. So another sort of general resource, if you want, this is actually from Eclypsium, the brilliant people at CyberEdge helped us put together a book called The Definitive Guide to Enterprise Firmware Security. This talks about how firmware is actually being weaponized. What does that really mean? And what is the supply chain impact of that? And it does, you'll see the messaging, the words are very much like what Eclypsium would say, the need to identify and then verify and then fortify your firmware. But it's not a marketing piece in that sense. It's really trying to give buyers a sense of like what they need to look at and why is this problem a problem today and why is it not solved by some of those vulnerability and say XDR type solutions. So if you need to sort of evangelize within your organization, this resource is available and free. You can go to eclypsium.com/ebook and download it. And then the last resource that I would point you to is we recently did a white paper out of Eclypsium talking about specifically this problem and what are the things that you can do, right? What are the things that you can do related to firmware scanning and firmware inspection within your supply chain? So you can also go to Eclypsium and go to our just resources section and you can download this. But it also for your teams, I think that the first thing that needs to happen in any organization is sort of a mental shift, an ownership shift. And if the security team takes this and say, hey, I want to share this with the operations team. What do you think about this? I want to share this with the CIO group. What do we think about this problem? Yes, it's going to raise hackles and cause some concerns, but what do we think about this? And can we start pulling this into our regular stand-ups, talking about what are the things that we're going to do around firmware? So this resource might be useful for that as well. With that, I want to see if there's any other questions left, Jake, and take a minute too to say, hey, thanks very much for helping me put this together. I think that your research paper fit really well with this topic and kind of the shift we're trying to create in industry. So I really appreciate it.
No, definitely. And we don't have any new questions here, but I also mutual respect here, man. Folks, go download those resources, but the ebook, the white paper, these are both fantastic resources for you to help evangelize this problem and take it out of the too hard pile, or at a minimum, put it in the too hard pile, right? So many folks today don't even have it in their view. We want to make sure and change that paradigm because, as Michael mentioned, as some of our questions kind of pointed to, there are regulations as well as requirements that are already on the books, let alone stuff that's coming, right? That's going to require better visibility and verification of that firmware. And Michael, you just gave an absolute master class on getting started and what to think about. And again, just fantastic work. And thank you for bringing this to SANS audience, man.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, guys. Really appreciate it.
Definitely. Well, hey, with that, I'm going to kick this back to Mary to close out our webinar. Thanks so much, folks.
Thank you so much, Jake and Michael, for your great presentation, and to Eclypsium for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.